Welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be experiencing a complete medieval market day from dawn to dusk, following a wool merchant through the bustling streets of 13th century England. Make sure to like this video to support our channel, and let us know in the comments where you are settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is where you are in the world. The first hints of dawn crept through the shuttered window of the small chamber above the shop, casting pale grey light across the rough wooden floorboards. Thomas Ashford stirred beneath his wool blanket, the familiar weight of it, a comfort against the morning chill of early September. He was a wool merchant, 42 years of age, with calloused hands and sharp eyes that had learned to judge the quality of fleece with a single touch. Today was market day in the town of Ledbury, and Thomas had been preparing for weeks. He rose quietly, careful not to wake his wife Margaret and their 3 children who slept in the adjacent room. The house was modest but respectable, befitting a merchant of middling success. Thomas pulled on his wool hose, securing them with leather points to his brays, then his linen undershirt and the tunic of sturdy brown wool that had seen many market days. Over this he fastened his leather belt, from which hung a small purse containing silver pennies and an eating knife in a worn sheath. His shoes were of good leather, recently repaired by the cobbler 2 streets over. Downstairs, Thomas found his apprentice Robert already awake, stoking the embers in the hearth back to life. The boy was 15, gangly and eager, the son of a freeman from a nearby village who had paid Thomas £3 to take the boy for a 7-year term. Robert would learn the wool trade, and if he proved himself worthy, might one day become a merchant himself. For now, he performed the tasks Thomas assigned without complaint. Together, they ate a simple breakfast of bread and small beer, the ale weak enough for morning consumption. Margaret came down as they finished, her hair covered with a linen coif, her gown a respectable grey wool. She had packed a basket with more bread, some cheese, and dried apples for their midday meal at the market. Thomas kissed her cheek, a gesture of affection that was genuine, despite the practical nature of their marriage arrangement 17 years prior. The cart stood ready in the narrow yard behind the house. Thomas and Robert had loaded it the previous evening with carefully bundled fleeces, each one wrapped in canvas to protect it from dirt and moisture. Thomas dealt primarily in raw wool, purchasing fleeces from shepherds and small farmers in the surrounding countryside, then selling them to drapers and clothiers, who would process the wool into yarn and fabric. It was an honest trade, if not particularly glamorous, and it had allowed Thomas to rise from the son of a freeman farmer to a burgess of the town with voting rights in the merchant guild. They hitched the cart to Bess, Thomas's sturdy mare, a dun-coloured beast of 14 hands with a patient temperament suited to the slow work of hauling goods. The sky was lightening now, revealing a day that promised to be fair, with high clouds that would not threaten rain. This was fortunate, as wet wool lost value and wet merchants lost patience. The journey to the market square took them through streets that were already beginning to stir with life. The town of Ledbury held its market every Wednesday by royal charter, a privilege granted 70 years earlier that brought commerce and prosperity to the settlement. Other merchants were making their way toward the square, some with handcarts, others leading pack horses laden with goods. Thomas recognised many of them and exchanged nods of greeting. There was Geoffrey the spice merchant, his cart fragrant with cinnamon and pepper, imported at great expense from the east. There was Alice the baker, her baskets piled high with loaves that were still warm. There was John the potter, his wares wrapped carefully in straw to prevent breakage during transport. The market square occupied the broad space before the church of St. Michael, a structure of golden stone that dominated the town. Around the edges of the square stood permanent buildings, the homes and shops of the wealthier merchants, their upper stories projecting out over the street to maximize space. But on market day, the square itself transformed into a temporary city of stalls and tents, a organized chaos that followed patterns established over generations. The market reeve, a stern man named Hugh, who served at the pleasure of the lord of the manor, was already present when Thomas arrived. Hugh's responsibility was to ensure that all merchants paid their stall fees and obeyed the market regulations. He carried a rod of office and wore the grave expression of a man who took his duties seriously. Thomas paid his fee of 3 pennies, receiving in return the right to occupy his usual spot along the western edge of the square. Setting up the stall was a practiced routine. Robert unloaded the trestles from the cart while Thomas untied the canvas covering. They erected a simple framework of wooden poles and stretched canvas over it to provide shade and some protection from weather. The fleeces were arranged on the trestle tables, positioned so that customers could examine them easily. Thomas had brought 30 fleeces in total, ranging in quality from the coarse wool of local sheep, suitable for rough cloth, to several finer fleeces from a flock kept by a minor nobleman 2 valleys over. These finer fleeces would command premium prices from drapers who supplied cloth to wealthier customers. By the time the church bell rang prime, marking the 3rd hour after dawn, the market was nearly fully established. The air filled with the sounds of commerce, the calls of merchants advertising their wares, the bleating of livestock in the animal pens at the far end of the square, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer as he made repairs to farm tools between customers. The smells were equally varied: fresh bread, roasting meat from the cook shop, the earthy scent of vegetables, the sharper tang of leather from the tanner's stall, and underlying it all, the distinctive lanolin smell of raw wool. Thomas's first customer of the day was a draper from Worcester, a man named Simon, whom Thomas had dealt with many times before. Simon was prosperous, his fine wool cloak and silver brooch marking his success. He examined each fleece carefully, running his fingers through the wool to judge its fineness, checking for burrs and dirt, assessing the staple length and crimp. This was expected behaviour, and Thomas stood patiently while Simon conducted his inspection. They both knew the ritual of negotiation that would follow. Simon selected 5 fleeces of middling quality, suitable for making the sort of sturdy broadcloth that sold well in towns throughout the Midlands. He offered 8 shillings for the lot. Thomas countered with 11. They settled at 9 shillings and 6pence, both men satisfied that they had driven a fair bargain. Simon paid in silver pennies, each coin carefully counted out and examined by Thomas to ensure they had not been clipped or otherwise debased. Coin clipping was a serious crime punishable by loss of a hand, but it still occurred with unfortunate frequency. Robert wrapped the fleeces in fresh canvas and helped Simon load them onto his pack horse. Thomas made a careful note of the transaction in his memory, for later recording in the account book he kept at home. Thomas had learned his letters from the parish priest as a boy, an unusual accomplishment for someone of his station, but one that had proven invaluable in his trade. The morning progressed with a steady stream of customers. A clothier from the village of Bosbury purchased 3 coarse fleeces for making peasant clothing. A weaver from Hereford examined the finest fleeces, but ultimately decided the price was too dear. A housewife bought a small amount of raw wool for spinning at home, paying with a handful of copper farthings. Between customers, Thomas kept a watchful eye on his goods and on the surrounding activity of the market. The marketplace operated under strict regulations, designed to ensure fairness and prevent fraud. All bread had to be of standard weight, and the reeve carried scales to check. All measures had to conform to the royal standard. No one was permitted to buy goods before the market bell had rung, as this forestalling gave unfair advantage. No one could intercept goods on the road before they reached the market, a practice called regrating that was strictly forbidden. The punishments for breaking these rules ranged from fines to time in the pillory that stood at the corner of the square, a wooden framework that held offenders by the head and hands, while townsfolk pelted them with refuse. Near midday, a commotion arose near the Reeves station. A baker had been accused of selling underweight loaves, and Hugh was conducting an investigation. A crowd gathered to watch as the Reeve weighed several loaves and found them wanting. The baker protested loudly that his scales were accurate, that the flour had been measured correctly, that some mistake had been made. But the evidence was clear, and Hugh imposed a fine of 2 shillings, a significant sum for a baker. The man paid, his face red with shame and anger, and the crowd dispersed with the satisfaction of seeing justice done. Thomas and Robert ate their midday meal in shifts, one always remaining with the stall, while the other sat in the shade of the church wall with the basket Margaret had packed. The bread was good, baked by Margaret herself in their own oven, a luxury not all households possessed. The cheese was sharp and salty, made from the milk of their single cow. The apples were last year's harvest, wrinkled but still sweet. Thomas washed down his meal with ale purchased from a brewer's store, served in a wooden cup that he returned when finished. The afternoon brought different customers than the morning. With the serious merchants having concluded their business, the market took on a more festive air. Housewives came to purchase vegetables and meat for their evening meals. Children darted between stalls, spending precious pennies on sweet cakes and ribbons. A jongleur performed near the church steps, juggling coloured balls and telling tales for whatever coins the crowd might toss. A friar in a grey habit preached against the sin of usury, his words falling on the distracted ears of merchants who had more immediate concerns than the state of their souls. Thomas sold several more fleeces during the afternoon, including 2 of his finest to a merchant who had come late to the market after conducting business in another town. The price was good, and Thomas allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This had been a profitable day, and there would be silver left over after purchasing the supplies Margaret needed and setting aside money for the quarterly tax. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, the character of the market changed once more. This was the time when merchants began to reduce their prices, preferring to sell goods rather than transport them home. Housewives who had waited patiently knew this and made their rounds looking for bargains. Thomas had only a handful of fleeces remaining, the coarser ones that had attracted less interest. He lowered his price slightly and soon found buyers for all but 2. The church bell rang vespers, marking the approaching end of the market day. The Reeve made his rounds, reminding merchants that all trading must cease at the appointed hour. Thomas and Robert began the process of packing up, a reverse of the morning setup but no less practiced. The remaining fleeces were wrapped and loaded onto the cart. The trestle tables were collapsed and stowed. The canvas shelter came down and was folded carefully. Around them, the entire market was engaged in the same activity. The temporary city was dismantling itself, transforming back into an empty square. Merchants counted their earnings and calculated their profits. Some had done well, their purses heavy with coin. Others had sold little and faced the prospect of returning home with goods they had hoped to sell. Such was the nature of market day, with its risks and rewards. Thomas helped an elderly merchant named Peter load his cart with unsold pottery. Peter's hands shook with age, and he moved slowly, but his pride would not allow him to ask for help directly. Thomas offered it anyway, as was proper among the merchant community. They had known each other for 20 years, and such kindnesses were both given and received without thought of immediate repayment. The bonds between merchants were as valuable as coin, for reputation and relationships determined who would extend credit and who would share information about market conditions in distant towns. The animal pens were emptying as farmers led home the livestock they had purchased or failed to sell. A few sheep bleated in confusion, and a cow lowed mournfully, sounds that would fade as the animals were driven down the roads leading out of town. The cook shop was closing, its fire being carefully banked for the night. The baker was loading his unsold loaves onto a handcart, bread that would be sold as day-old tomorrow at reduced price or fed to his pigs if it remained unsold. Thomas secured the last of his goods on the cart and gave Bess a handful of oats, which she crunched contentedly. The mare had stood patiently all day, and she deserved this small reward. Robert climbed up onto the driver's seat while Thomas walked alongside, his hand resting on the cart as they made their way out of the square. The journey home took them past the tavern, where some merchants had stopped to drink ale and discuss the day's business. Thomas was tempted to join them, but Margaret would have supper waiting, and his children would want to hear about the market. There would be other evenings for the tavern. Besides, his purse was heavier than it had been this morning, and he was eager to count his earnings properly and record them in his book. The streets were quieter now, with most people returning to their homes. A few boys played a game with a leather ball in a side street, their shouts echoing off the buildings. A cat slunk along a wall, hunting for mice in the gathering dusk. The shutters on most houses were being closed against the night, and here and there, candlelight flickered in windows. When they reached his house, Thomas helped Robert stable Bess and unload the cart. The 2 unsold fleeces would remain in his shop until the next market day, or until a customer came to his door during the week. Such direct sales were permitted to burgesses like Thomas, another privilege of his status. Robert bid Thomas good night and headed to his own small room above the shop, where he would sleep until dawn brought another day of work. Thomas entered his house to find his family gathered around the table. Margaret had prepared a pottage of vegetables and barley, thick and savoury, with a piece of pork for flavour. There was fresh bread and butter, and more of the ale that seemed to flow endlessly in an English household. His children, 2 boys and a girl ranging in age from 6 to 13, clamoured for stories of the market. Thomas obliged them, describing the jongleurs' performance and the baker's shame, the fine horses he had seen, and the exotic spices on Geoffrey's stall. After supper, while Margaret cleaned the bowls and set the house in order for the night, Thomas sat at his small writing desk with a candle for light. He opened his account book, a precious possession that contained the record of his business transactions. With careful strokes of his quill, dipped in oak gall ink, he recorded the day's sales. 5 fleeces to Simon of Worcester for 9 shillings and 6pence. 3 fleeces to Richard of Bosbury for 4 shillings. The list continued, each transaction noted with the customer's name, the quantity sold and the price received. When he had finished, Thomas added up the total, 31 shillings and 4pence. From this, he would need to subtract the cost of the market stall, the price he had paid the farmers for the fleeces, and various other expenses. But even after these deductions, there would be a profit of several shillings, money that would help feed his family through the winter and perhaps allow him to purchase a few small luxuries. Margaret wanted a new cooking pot, as the old one had cracked. His eldest son needed new shoes, and Thomas himself had his eye on a better quality cloak, one that would better reflect his status as a successful merchant. but those were concerns for another day. For now, Thomas closed his account book and extinguished the candle, making his way upstairs in the darkness. He knew every step and floorboard of his house and needed no light to find his way. In the bedchamber, he undressed quietly and slipped beneath the wool blanket beside Margaret, who murmured sleepily and moved closer to him for warmth. Outside, the town of Ledbury settled into silence. The market square stood empty once more, a blank space that would remain so until the following Wednesday, when the cycle would begin again. Merchants would come, goods would be sold, bargains would be struck, and the endless dance of commerce would continue as it had for generations and would for generations to come. And Thomas Ashford, wool merchant, burgess, husband and father, would rise once more before dawn to participate in that dance. His life measured in fleeces sold and pennies earned, in the steady accumulation of modest prosperity that marked a successful life in medieval England. Before we begin, if you enjoy this content and want to join our community of nighttime travellers, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications to support our channel. The bells of the abbey rang out across the valley, their deep bronze tones marking the hour of Lauds as the first pale light touched the eastern sky. In a modest stone cottage on the edge of the village of Ashwell, Eleanor Hawkins opened her eyes to the familiar sounds of early morning. She was a baker's wife, 34 years of age, with flour perpetually dusted in the creases of her hands, and the faint scent of yeast that seemed to cling to her clothing, no matter how thoroughly she washed. Today was market day, and Eleanor had been awake twice already during the night to tend the dough that would become the loaves she would sell. She rose from the bed she shared with her husband John, careful not to disturb him, though he would wake soon enough. The September air held a chill that promised autumn's approach, and Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders over her linen shift before padding barefoot down the narrow wooden stairs to the bakehouse. This was a separate structure attached to the main cottage, built of stone with a slate roof to minimize the risk of fire. The large brick oven dominated one wall, its mouth like a great dark cave when cold, but now glowing with the embers John had banked the previous evening. Eleanor had learned the baker's trade from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before her. When she married John 12 years ago, it had been a practical arrangement that suited both families. John had inherited his father's bakehouse, but lacked a wife with the skills to run it properly. Eleanor had the skills, but no bakehouse of her own. Together, they had built a successful business that fed the village and provided enough income to keep them in modest comfort. They had been blessed with 4 children, 3 of whom had survived past infancy, a ratio that Eleanor gave thanks for each Sunday at Mass. The dough had risen beautifully overnight in the wooden troughs, great pale mounds that gave off the sweet-sour smell of fermentation. Eleanor's practiced eye could judge the readiness of dough by sight and touch, knowledge that came from years of daily repetition. She began the work of shaping loaves, her hands moving with the automatic precision of long habit. Each portion of dough was weighed carefully on the brass scales that hung from a beam. For the assize of bread, the law governing the weight and price of loaves was strictly enforced. A baker found selling underweight bread faced heavy fines or time in the pillory, and Eleanor had no intention of bringing such shame upon her household. John appeared as she was shaping the 10th loaf, his face still creased from sleep, his greying hair standing up in tufts. He was a solid man, broad in the shoulders from years of kneading dough and hefting sacks of grain. Without speaking, they fell into their morning routine. John used a long wooden peel to load the shaped loaves into the oven, sliding them onto the hot brick floor where they would bake. Eleanor began preparing a second batch, mixing flour and water and the sourdough starter they maintained in a crock, feeding it daily like a living thing, which in a sense it was. The bakehouse grew warm as the oven radiated heat, a welcome change from the morning chill. Through the small window, Eleanor could see the sky lightening, revealing a day that looked fair and dry. This was good for market day, as rain made everything more difficult. The road to Ledbury would be easier to travel, and customers would be more inclined to linger at the stalls rather than hurrying home to escape the weather. Their eldest son Geoffrey, a boy of 11 with his father's stocky build and his mother's quick mind, came down to help. He had been apprenticed to his father in the informal way of family trades, learning by watching and doing rather than through any formal contract. He fetched water from the well in the yard, lugging the heavy buckets with the determination of a child trying to prove himself useful. Eleanor's two younger children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5, still slept upstairs, and would continue to do so until the sun was fully risen. The first batch of loaves came out of the oven with crusts the colour of chestnuts, crackling as they cooled on the wooden racks John had built for that purpose. The smell of fresh bread filled the bakehouse and drifted out into the village, an aroma that made even the full-bellied hungry. Eleanor tapped each loaf on the bottom, listening for the hollow sound that indicated proper baking. All were perfect, as she had known they would be. While John loaded the second batch into the oven, Eleanor prepared their own breakfast. She cut thick slices from a loaf baked the previous day, one that had a small imperfection in the crust, and thus could not be sold at full price. She toasted these over the fire and spread them with butter from the churn, adding a drizzle of honey that a neighbouring farmer had traded for bread. The family ate together at the wooden table, washing down the bread with weak ale that Eleanor brewed herself in the large kettle that hung in the main cottage. By the time the church bell rang prime, they had 40 loaves cooled and ready for market, along with a dozen small round rolls that sold well to travellers and merchants who wanted something they could eat while walking. Eleanor wrapped the loaves carefully in clean linen cloths and packed them into large wicker baskets designed for the purpose. John loaded the baskets onto their handcart, a sturdy two-wheeled affair that he pulled while Eleanor and Geoffrey walked alongside. The road to Ledbury was already busy with people heading to market. Eleanor recognised many of them, for the rhythm of market day brought together the same faces week after week. There was Agnes the egg seller, her baskets carefully padded with straw to protect her fragile goods. There was Walter the Fletcher, his cart filled with bundles of arrows destined for the archery butts where men practised as required by law. There was Mary, the herb woman, her weathered face framed by a faded wimple, her basket fragrant with rosemary and thyme and fennel. They walked together in loose groups, exchanging greetings and news as they travelled. Agnes reported that her best-laying hen had gone broody and would need to be coaxed back to production. Walter complained about the price of goose feathers, which had risen sharply due to some disruption in supply that he did not fully understand. Mary spoke of a sickness in the next village, a fever that had taken 2 children and an old man, and advised everyone to wear a sprig of rue for protection. Eleanor accepted a small bunch of the bitter herb and tucked it into her belt, a precaution that might or might not prove effective but cost nothing and might bring peace of mind. The town of Ledbury appeared before them as they crested a low hill, its church spire rising above the clustered buildings like a stone finger pointing toward heaven. The market square was already filling with merchants setting up their stalls, transforming the open space into a temporary city of commerce. Eleanor could hear the sounds carrying across the distance, the calls of merchants, the clatter of wooden poles being erected. the general hubbub of many people engaged in purposeful activity. They made their way to the section of the market where food sellers traditionally gathered, a practice enforced more by custom than by any official regulation. The market reeve, a humorless man named Hugh who took his duties with grave seriousness, was making his rounds collecting stall fees. Eleanor paid her 3 pennies and received in return a small lead token that proved she had paid, a token she tucked into the purse that hung from her belt beneath her outer skirt. Setting up their stall was a simple affair compared to some of the more elaborate arrangements around them. John unfolded a trestle table they had brought on the handcart and covered it with a clean linen cloth. Eleanor arranged the loaves in neat rows, knowing that presentation mattered as much as quality when it came to attracting customers. The small rolls she placed in a separate basket, each one visible and tempting. A painted wooden sign that John had commissioned years ago hung from the front of the table, declaring in both pictures and words, for those who could read, that this was Hawkins bread, Est. Anno Domini 2067. The market came alive as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The reeve rang the bell that signalled the official start of trading, and immediately the square filled with the noise of commerce. Merchants called out their wares in practiced sing-song voices. Customers moved from stall to stall, comparing prices and quality. Children darted through the crowd on errands for their parents, or simply enjoying the excitement of market day. Eleanor's first customer was a housewife she recognised from previous markets, a woman named Beatrice who kept house for a minor gentleman in one of the outlying manors. Beatrice examined the loaves with a critical eye, pressing gently on the crust to judge freshness, holding them up to her nose to smell. She selected 3 large loaves and 2 rolls, paying with silver pennies that Eleanor tested by biting gently, a habit ingrained by years of discovering clipped or counterfeit coins. The silver was good, and Eleanor wrapped the purchases in a cloth Beatrice had brought for the purpose. The morning progressed in a steady rhythm of sales and conversation. A merchant from Worcester bought 6 rolls to feed himself and his servants during their day at market. A farmer's wife purchased 2 loaves, complaining about the price even as she counted out her pennies, a ritual of negotiation that both women understood was more custom than genuine protest. A group of labourers working on repairs to the church bought bread and cheese from neighbouring stalls, sitting on the church steps to eat their midday meal even though the sun had barely reached its zenith. Eleanor kept a watchful eye on her remaining stock while simultaneously observing the theatre of the market around her. 2 stalls down, a draper was engaged in heated negotiation with a customer over the price of wool cloth, both men's voices rising as they argued over measurements and quality. Across the square, the pillory stood empty for now, though Eleanor knew from experience that it rarely remained so for the entire day. Some merchant would inevitably be found cheating on weights or measures, or selling goods unfit for consumption, and would suffer the public humiliation that served as both punishment and deterrent. Near midday, a commotion drew the attention of everyone in the market. A young thief had been caught trying to steal a chicken from the poultry sellers' cages. The boy, ragged and thin with the look of genuine hunger about him, was dragged before the reeve by the outraged chicken seller, a large woman whose voice carried across the entire square as she demanded justice. Hugh questioned the boy, who admitted his crime with the hopeless air of someone who knew what was coming. The reeve pronounced sentence, a day in the pillory and a fine of 6pence to the chicken seller for her trouble. The boy had no 6pence, and likely no friends or family who could pay it for him, so he was locked into the pillory while a crowd gathered to watch and jeer. Eleanor felt a pang of pity. remembering years when her own family had struggled to put food on the table. But she said nothing. The law was the law, and theft was theft, regardless of motive. She gave Geoffrey a small coin and told him to buy a cup of water from the water seller, instructing him quietly to give the water to the boy in the pillory when no one was watching. Geoffrey nodded, understanding without needing explanation. The afternoon brought a different sort of customer than the morning had. With the serious household business concluded, people came to the market for pleasure as much as necessity. A jongleur performed near the church, his clever tricks with coloured balls drawing an appreciative crowd. A friar preached about the virtue of charity, his words falling on ears more interested in earthly bargains than heavenly rewards. Children spent precious farthings on sweet cakes and ribbons, their faces bright with the simple joy of possession. Eleanor sold her remaining bread steadily throughout the afternoon. A travelling tinker bought 2 rolls and asked after lodging in the village, which Eleanor directed him toward the widow Thompson, who sometimes took in travellers. A group of women from a nearby manor purchased the last of the large loaves, gossiping among themselves about matters Eleanor paid no attention to, having learned long ago that the business of the gentry was best left to the gentry. By the time the church bell rang vespers, Eleanor had sold all but 3 loaves. These she would take home and feed to her family over the coming days, or use to make bread pudding, a dish her children loved. The market was beginning to wind down around her, merchants packing up their goods and counting their earnings. Some had done well, their purses heavy with coin. Others had sold little and wore expressions of worry about how they would manage until the next market day. John collapsed the trestle table and loaded it back onto the handcart, while Eleanor wrapped the unsold loaves and placed them in the basket. Geoffrey helped his father secure everything for the journey home, his young face serious with concentration as he tied the knots that would keep the load stable. Around them, the temporary city was dismantling itself, vendors calling out final bargains to passers-by, livestock being led away to farms and fields, the detritus of a day's commerce being swept into gutters by town boys hired for the purpose. Eleanor paused to help old Mary, the herb woman, fold up her stall. Mary's hands were gnarled with age and the joint evil that made movement painful, and she accepted Eleanor's assistance with quiet gratitude. They had known each other for many years, had stood at adjacent stalls through countless market days, and such small kindnesses were part of the unspoken bonds that held their community together. Mary pressed a bunch of dried lavender into Eleanor's hand as thanks, and Eleanor accepted it, knowing that refusing would give offence. The journey home was slower than the morning's trip, as everyone was tired from the long day, and the road was crowded with people and carts all heading in various directions. The sun was sinking toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that would have been beautiful if Eleanor had not been too weary to pay much attention. Her feet ached in her worn leather shoes, and her back protested from hours of standing. But her purse was heavier than it had been that morning, and the day had been successful by any measure that mattered. They walked in comfortable silence, John pulling the handcart, Eleanor and Geoffrey walking alongside. Other travellers moved around them, some calling out farewells as they branched off onto different paths leading to different villages. The evening air was cooling rapidly, carrying the scent of wood smoke as families lit their hearth fires against the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and another answered, a rural conversation that needed no human words. When they reached home, the younger children came running to meet them, full of questions about the market and what treats might have been brought back for them. Eleanor distributed small honey cakes she had purchased from another baker, a woman whose skill with sweet goods exceeded Eleanor's own. The children devoured these with pleasure, while Eleanor and John unloaded the cart and put away the market equipment in the shed behind the bakehouse. Inside the cottage, Eleanor prepared their evening meal, a pottage made from vegetables and barley that had been simmering over the fire all day, tended by a neighbour woman who Eleanor paid with bread. There was cheese and the remaining bread from the morning's baking, and ale that tasted particularly good after the long day. The family ate together at the table, the children chattering about their day, while Eleanor and John exchanged the satisfied glances of partners who had worked well together. After the meal was finished and the children sent to bed, Eleanor sat by the fire with her mending basket, while John smoked his pipe, a luxury he allowed himself once a week. They did not speak much, but the silence between them was comfortable, the quiet of two people who had shared a life for many years and did not need constant words to feel companionship. Outside, the village settled into darkness, shutters closing against the night, candles being extinguished one by one as families retired to their beds. Eleanor finished darning a hole in Geoffrey's stocking and set aside her mending. She banked the fire carefully, ensuring it would last until morning when it would be fed back to life. Upstairs, she checked on the children, all three sleeping soundly in the bed they shared, their faces peaceful in the way only children's faces could be. In her own chamber, she undressed and slipped beneath the wool blanket beside John, who was already half asleep. Tomorrow would bring another day of baking, of kneading dough and tending the oven, of selling bread to neighbours and travellers. In 6 days, another market day would come, and the cycle would repeat itself as it had for years, and would for years to come. This was Eleanor's life, measured in loaves baked and pennies earned, in the steady rhythm of work and rest that marked the seasons and the years. It was not an easy life, but it was hers, and she had learned to find satisfaction in its simple repetitions, in the knowledge that her labour fed her family and her community, that she was part of an ancient tradition of women who had turned grain into bread since time beyond memory. The village of Ashwell lay quiet under the stars, its people sleeping the deep sleep of honest labour. In the bakehouse, the sourdough starter waited in its crock, alive and patient, ready to begin the process again when morning came. And Eleanor Hawkins, baker's wife, mother, craftswoman, drifted into sleep with flour still faintly visible in the creases of her hands, the scent of yeast clinging to her hair. Her last conscious thought a brief calculation of how much grain remained in the storehouse, and when John would need to purchase more from the miller. Then even these practical concerns faded, and there was only darkness and rest and the promise of another day to come.